Warning: the views expressed in this video are only those of the teacher. Or maybe not. Maybe he's playing devil's advocate to encourage you to think about both sides. Then again, maybe he really means what he says. You can't really tell, and he won't tell you. Trust me. And anyway, who cares what he says? He doesn't matter. You're the learner, so why not form your own opinion based on facts? The point is, think for yourself.
It was February 27th of 1991 when President George H.W. Bush made a special address to the nation from the Oval Office.
Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal. This is a victory for the United Nations, for all mankind, for the rule of law, and for what is right. After consulting with Secretary of Defense Cheney, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Powell, and our coalition partners, I am pleased to announce that at midnight tonight, Eastern Standard Time, exactly 100 hours since ground operations commenced and 6 weeks since the start of Operation Desert Storm, all United States and coalition forces will suspend offensive combat operations.
What President George H.W. Bush did there did not sound all that complicated. Basically, this was good news. This was good news back in February of 1991. This was news the country had been praying for, in fact. The United States stopped Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, from seizing a sovereign, independent nation, the nation of Kuwait. This was the story of the first Gulf War, one a lot of people call the good Gulf War. It was short. It lasted just 6 weeks in the winter of 1991, and there were relatively few casualties among American service personnel. Nothing like the dire predictions that had been made as the U.S. was amassing troops in the desert before that war. And now, when President Bush made the statement that it was over, it was time to celebrate. This was the first full-scale U.S. military engagement since the disaster of Vietnam. And now, in this triumphant moment, it was said America had finally kicked its Vietnam syndrome. The country was cheering. President George H.W. Bush very much wanted this to be the end of the story, at least when it came to America's military involvement in Iraq under his watch. But even as all those celebrations were happening, even as all those parades were taking place, there was another story playing out. There was a humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Iraq in the wake of the withdrawal of U.S. troops after the first Gulf War. It was clear that it was a tragedy made in part due by the way we ended that war, because that war was ending, and as Saddam Hussein's forces were getting routed in Kuwait, and as his grip on power within his own country was being called into question, when all of that was happening, George H.W. Bush decided to make a plea directly to the Iraqi people, especially to the Kurds, to the Kurdish people, an ethnic minority group that had long been persecuted by Saddam's regime. What Bush told them to do was step up and overthrow Hussein once and for all. Here is what the Kurds heard. It was a message from them from Bush on the Voice of America, a U.S. government-funded radio network. This aired in the Kurdish parts of Iraq just days before the war ended.
Another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
A couple days after the American troops withdrew, Bush repeated that message to the Iraqi people, that they should force Saddam out. They should push him aside. That's what they said. That's what he said. And so, with the encouragement of the President of the United States, whose army just humiliated Saddam Hussein, the Kurds acted. In March and April of 1991, the Kurds in the north of Iraq and also some Shiites elsewhere in the country staged an uprising. They heeded President Bush's call and they moved to get rid of Saddam. But they weren't successful. They didn't win. Many of them had thought, many of them had expected the mighty American military would have their back, but it didn't. America did not step in to help them. It did not intervene to help them from getting crushed by Saddam. The backlash they felt was swift and brutal. They had thought Saddam was weak, but the moment was right. They thought the moment was right to strike, but Saddam was desperate to show that he still had power in his own land and that he still was in control. So he undertook a brutal campaign of retribution against the Kurds, against the people who had long been considered his enemy. In an eerie parallel to what we're now witnessing, what we're seeing today, Iraqi Kurds in the spring of 1991 left their villages in droves in order to escape the vengeance of Saddam Hussein's army. The Kurds hid in refugee camps in the mountains for many months. They were dying from cold, they were dying from hunger, from thirst. They were afraid to descend the mountains, knowing that if they did, Saddam's army would be waiting to kill them.
Winter is coming to Penguin Camp, just inside Iraq's border with Iran. At least 150,000 Kurdish refugees are in the area. It's miserable and dangerous, but Saddam Hussein frightens them more than the cold. Some are past caring what happens to them.
It's better to die than to live like this.
They know that if they return to the valleys and to the plains, the weather will be warmer. But too many of them believe Saddam's men will kill them if they try to go home, and they prefer to take their chances in the mountains.
Now, the U.S. did, in the end, help those refugees with humanitarian aid, but President Bush refused to help them militarily, even in the face of criticism that he had encouraged them and then abandoned them, even after risking them to urge them to risk their own lives.
To enjoy sporting holidays like today's, free from the carping of those who opposed his Gulf policy. But his aides say Bush feels he now is taking a bum rap for the suffering of Kurdish and Shiite refugees.
Conflicts have been raging in Iraq for many years, and we're helping out, and we're going to continue to help these refugees, but I do not want one single soldier or airman shoved into a civil war in Iraq that's been going on for ages, and I'm not going to have that.
More than 2 million Kurds fled Saddam in 1991 during the fallout from that failed uprising. For a period of time that year, as many as 2,000 Kurds were dying every single day, trapped in the mountains and in the border between Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. The United States did eventually help impose a no-fly zone over Kurdish Iraq, which helped the Kurds achieve a degree of security against Saddam's military forces. But more than a decade later, more than a decade after the first Gulf War, when the next Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, made the case for the second war in Iraq, well, a part of their justification for going in was based on what had happened back in 1991, what happened when Saddam had unleashed his forces on the Kurds. And not just then, there was also a long history of Saddam targeting and persecuting the Kurds and other minority groups in Iraq. That targeting and that persecution was one of the reasons that George W. Bush's administration cited for removing Hussein from power. And it was during America's second Iraq war that the Kurds faced a choice. Could they trust the United States against Saddam Hussein? Would they join America's war against Saddam? Their answer back in 2003 was a resounding yes. They fought alongside America and fought to topple Saddam Hussein.
These are the soldiers who will fight with GIs. 90,000 Kurds say U.S. officials are ready today to protect paratroopers dropping into northern Iraq.
We have a good military capability, hardened by and tested in the battlefield. These forces have been in the forefront of the struggle for democracy in Iraq.
Though Salah refused to point out likely U.S. bases, NBC News has learned there are at least 3.
In northern Iraq, U.S. forces fought the war side by side with Kurdish fighters. In the aftermath of the Iraq War in 2003, as fighting threatened to disintegrate the rest of the country, Kurdistan, that Kurdish area in the northern part of Iraq, well, it actually began to flourish. It's a region that had a degree of autonomy. People there had something rare that the rest of Iraq, none of the Kurds had, and certainly none in their past. Almost as if they had their own country. Their capital, Erbil, has grown in the last 10 years into a powerhouse. Construction has boomed in Erbil. The Kurds are entitled to roughly a fifth of the country's oil revenue. There's been reporting lately that they're striking their own export deals with neighboring countries. All this is giving the Kurds the wealth to grow their capital or bill. It's not just an island of stability in Iraq, but also into an invaluable strategic base for the United States. There are several American personnel now stationed in Erbil, and now with this current crisis in Iraq, it's Erbil. It's the stability of the existence that the Kurds have made for themselves in post-Saddam Iraq that is now facing a grave threat from ISIS. Up until now, it has taken over large swaths of mostly Sunni Iraq, but now they're moving into the Kurdish region, and they're threatening the Kurdish capital. America's relationship with the Kurds and Iraq is a complicated one. We let them down back in 1991, and we fought alongside them a decade later, and they've been one of our staunchest allies in the region ever since. And now we're facing a decision of how far we're going to go to protect the Kurds and their interests that in many other ways do overlap with America's interests. Since the president's announcement that he was authorizing targeted strikes in Iraq, American military forces have now carried out some of those strikes, including hitting ISIS targets near Erbil. Among the questions facing the Obama administration are these strikes going to be enough to protect our allies, the Kurds, from the advancing ISIS army? If the United States is the United States that's prepared to stay in the fight with the Kurds as long as it takes, well, what does that mean? Are we risking another protracted military engagement in Iraq? If we're not prepared to make that kind of commitment, or if we change our minds, does that mean we're once again going to abandon the Kurds in their time of need? What is possible for this current American engagement in Iraq? What isn't possible? Does America, does this nation that's so tired of war, especially war in Iraq, do the people of this country think that protecting the city of Erbil, protecting the Kurdish people from ISIS, is worth our military engagement, re-engagement in Iraq now? The Obama administration is facing some complicated questions and some very high stakes. I have some questions for you. Does the president need congressional approval for the use of force in northern Iraq? If he chooses to attack the source of the insurgency, which is in Syria, will he need congressional approval in that case? What might be the difference?